7, I thought it was time that I experimented with a bit of new technology. I just wanted to say well done on your work on poetry so far. I've been really impressed by the things that you've written and the way that you're engaging with the classes. So really well done. This video now, I'm just going to give you a quick talk through of the class. So you can either watch the video first and then complete the lesson, or you can do it on the video and just kind of pause the video and write. Okay. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at a poem in Mrs. Tilcher's class by Carol Ann Duffy. So if you could write that as your title now, please, as well as today's date. And then your learning objective, if you could also write that underneath, it is to consider how imagery is used in a poem to present memories. Okay, so copy this down. Imagery is a term used for language used in a way that creates pictures in your mind. It includes metaphors, similes and personification. These are not the only kinds of imagery, but these are the ones that we're focusing on today. Remind yourself about the 3 types of imagery from the knowledge organiser. Metaphor, a way of describing something by saying that it is something else without using the words like or as. For example, the road was a ribbon of moonlight. Personification, the description of a non-living thing as if it had human qualities or feelings. For example, the chair groaned as the giant sat down on it. So we all know that chairs can't groan, so that's a human characteristic. Simile, a comparison of one thing to something else using the words like or as. For example, my love is like a red rose. I wandered lonely as a cloud. Okay, now we're going to read a poem and try to find some of these techniques. The poem that we're going to read is written by Carol Ann Duffy. She's a British poet who was the Poet Laureate, the nation's official poet appointed by the Queen, between 2009 and 2019. In this poem, she describes the joys of primary school and explores the children there growing up. Mrs. Tilcher, from the poem's title, is portrayed as a loving teacher who has deep effect on her pupils. She was one of Duffy's teachers as a child. So let's just think about that then. So we know what the poem's going to be about. It's about her experience and her memories of her teacher that she really liked at primary school. So what I'll do now, let's just scroll up and look at the poem. Here it is. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 stanzas. Let me just tell you about the vocab in the poem before we read it together. So it talks about the Nile. You probably know this, but the Nile is a river in Egypt that children would have looked up on a map. Is that? Yeah, we've got a little example of the Nile there. Tana and Aswan are other places that the teacher pointed out. The word enthralling means really interesting. And this here, if you can look at this picture, a skittle of milk is what children used to have at break time. So in every school in the land, primary school children would get a free mini bottle of milk and be able to drink that. Little interesting fact for you, the Prime Minister that got rid of that was called Margaret Thatcher, and that she abolished the free milk. She took the free milk away from primary schools, and some people used to call her Maggie Thatcher Milk Snatcher. Quite nice rhyme there. Okay, dunce then is a class clown. So what I'll do now is I'll read the poem once, then if I were you, I would pause the video, read it again yourself in your head, and then I would either listen to me reading it again or read it again yourself out loud. It's quite, oh, made it jump. You know, as a teacher, having studied English at university, I read a poem at least 3 times before I even begin to try and think about it. Okay, so it's important that you give yourself enough time with all of the poems in this unit so that you can understand them and just enjoy them and appreciate them first before you get into trying to answer any questions about them or think about them in an analytical way. Okay. In Mrs. Tilcher's class, you could travel up the Blue Nile with your finger, tracing the route while Mrs. Tilcher chanted the scenery. Tana, Ethiopia, Khartoum, Aswan. That for an hour, then a skittle of milk, and the chalky pyramids rubbed into dust. A window opened with a long pole. The laugh of a bell swung by a running child. This was better than home. Enthralling books. The classroom glowed like a sweet shop. Sugar paper, coloured shapes. Brady and Hindley faded, like the faint, uneasy smudge of a mistake. Mrs. Tilcher loved you. Some mornings you found she'd left a gold star by your name. The scent of a pencil slowly, carefully shaved. A xylophone's nonsense heard from another form. Over the Easter term, the inky tadpoles changed from commas into exclamation marks. 3 frogs hopped in the playground, freed by a dunce, followed by a line of kids jumping and croaking away from the lunch queue. A rough boy told you how you were born. You kicked him, but stared at your parents appalled when you got back home. That feverish July, the air tasted of electricity. A tangible alarm made you always untidy, hot, fractious under the heavy, sexy sky. You asked her how you were born, and Mrs. Tilcher smiled, then turned away. Reports were handed out. You ran through the gates, impatient to be grown. The sky split open into a thunderstorm. Okay, so as I said, pause, read the poem again yourself. 1 or 2 times, and then perhaps listen to it again. Just looking at something else I didn't point out that you might not know. Brady and Hindley, that's Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. They were known as the Moors murderers. So they were they murdered children and buried them all over the Yorkshire moors. It was a very famous ongoing news story. I think it was in the 1970s, and perhaps you can look it up on Wikipedia if you're interested. But certainly it's something that primary school children would have known or have heard about. And so the idea that Brady and Hindley faded like the faint, uneasy smudge of a mistake, it's that Mrs. Tilcher's classroom is so safe and lovely and full of nice kind of positive things that they forget about any kind of disturbing things that they might hear about sort of mass murderers. Okay, any other vocab that I thought you might need to know? Oh yeah, so if we look at this last stanza here then, a tangible alarm. So this alarm can mean like a literal, like a morning watch or clock alarm. But here I think it's a kind of a state of alarm. So that kind of feeling of being on edge or being wary of something. A tangible means something that you can always kind of touch and really, really feel. So this is saying that feverish, a really kind of hot July, this feeling of being on edge or being alarmed, being really alert, made you always untidy, hot, fractious. Fractious means kind of, almost irritable. I was thinking, kind of fractious, you're quite sort of itchy, a lot of pent up energy. Okay, so that's the poem. What you've got to do next is, in your books, write down the correct answer to each of these questions. Just the letter will do. You don't even need to copy out the question here, okay? Don't copy the question, so you just write 1 and then A, B, C, whatever you think it is. So question 1. When Duffy says you could travel up the Blue Nile with your finger, she means A, that the class went on a school trip to the Nile River, B, that she remembers making the shape of the Nile River with her finger, C, that she remembers learning what it would be like to travel up the Nile River. 2. Why were the chalky pyramids rubbed into dust? A, because the pyramids are in Egypt, B, because the pyramids had been drawn on the blackboard with chalk and then were rubbed out, C, because the pyramids had mostly fallen apart into the desert by then. 3. What was the sign that the teacher loved you? Was it A, she sharpened your pencil for you, B. She played the xylophone for you. C. Excuse me, she left a gold star by your name. 4. Just 2 more. What is the sign in verse 3 that the children were growing up? A. The tadpoles turned into frogs. B. Someone in the class played a naughty trick by freeing the frogs. C. People started to talk about how you were born. Or D. All of the above. 5. Why do you think that the poem ends with a thunderstorm? Is it A. Because it was the summer term and there are often storms in July? B. To symbolise how the children leaving year 6 felt a bit unsettled? Or C. To suggest that nothing will ever seem as safe as primary school? Okay, now go to the end of the document and check your answers. So when you've done that, you can do that. Task 2. Look back at the poem and find an example of a simile, a metaphor and personification to write in your books. If you are stuck, focus on the blue highlighted lines. Write them in your books like this. So don't forget you've got the definitions at the top. So look at the definitions again and then pick them up. Pick out the simile, metaphor and personification. When you've done that, you'll move on to task 3. Now pick one of these pieces of imagery and explain in a C's paragraph how Carol Ann Duffy uses imagery to help us imagine her school days. C's, just a reminder, it's statement, evidence. So statement saying something about the piece that you're picking out. Evidence will be the quote. I is for inference, so what it suggests to you, what ideas it makes you think of. Z, zooming in on a word, so focusing on which is the important word in your quote, and then E, exploring it. So explain in the C's paragraph how Carol Ann Duffy uses imagery to help us imagine her school days. Use this frame to help you. Now remember, you don't have to use this frame, but it's there to help you. You need to make sure that you have all of these elements in it, but if you prefer to use other wording or extend it in any way, you absolutely can do. Okay. Lastly then, can you write a C's paragraph about each different type of imagery used? Try to vary the sentence stems that you use in each paragraph. So that's my challenge to you. You know if you should be attempting the challenge. Okay, so that's all from me. Well done and keep up the good work. See you tomorrow.